Welcome to Crime to Burn. Today we have a special guest, Miss Kristine Bunch. We covered Kristine's wrongful conviction case in episodes 32 and 33. To recap, investigators accused Kristine of a fatal arson that claimed the life of her son based on an outdated and debunked arson investigation myth. When forensic evidence did not support their theory, investigators allegedly colluded with forensic chemists to alter test results, which secured Kristine's wrongful conviction, and a judge sentenced her to 60 years in prison for a crime she did not commit. Kristine fought for truth for nearly 2 decades, and her conviction was ultimately overturned. Today, Kristine Bunch is joining us to discuss the investigation that landed her in prison and discuss with us the work she's been doing since her release. This is Crime to Burn. Welcome to Crime to Burn, where we explore the dark, sooty landscape where true crime intersects with arson and criminal negligence. Join us as we sift through the ashes to bring you the story of what really happened. Welcome back to Crime to Burn. This is a special feature. I am April, a fire protection engineer and former firefighter. And today we're joined by Kristine Bunch. Welcome, Kristine. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
So the first question I have for you is there anything that I got wrong that you heard in the episode that we need to correct for our listeners?
I think the big thing is, people have this misconception that when I left school, that it was so I could, just drift and party. Mm-hmm. I haven't shared often, but my mom was in a very abusive relationship and would just disappear for weeks at a time. So it was essentially my brother and I trying to keep everything going in our house. And Tom...
So it was a hardship.
It was very much a hardship. Tom was the guy she dated that she didn't stay with because he was a good guy. Mm-hmm. I mean, he wanted, her to straighten up and be a full-time mom and do what she was supposed to do. So when they split up, we were devastated because this is the first good guy she's dated that entire time. And he stuck around. He was there for us. He became a sounding board. He would take us to visit our dad who lived an hour away. So he just, stepped into that role and really became the father, that we had there on hand. My brother, that relationship is cemented. He supported me through the whole ordeal.
Right.
I don't think most people know, he was 17 when this happened. He ended up quitting school and working 3 jobs so he could take care of me. He could take care of Trent after I gave birth. My brother is still stepping out. I take him to speaking engagements to talk about what it's like for family members and how he can support them. So I think those are just, personal things that people don't get from the transcripts or any of the reports.
Well, I'm really glad to hear that you had that strong support network that obviously we don't get from the court transcripts and everything. And it sounds like Tom was more than just a friend. Like, I think I read that he actually babysat your son while you're working on getting your welding certificate. Is that true?
He did. He was actually the first person I told when I found out I was pregnant with Tony. And it's always so shocking to me. I got pregnant with Tony while I was on birth control. So I'd been sick and had 2 rounds of antibiotic, and I didn't realize that meant I wasn't protected. So then when I went to the doctor, I was like, I've had the flu for 4 months. I can't seem to get over it. What's going on? And so then he was the one to tell me, we probably should have talked about this, and now you're going to have a baby. So I went back to Tom and I was like, can I do this? What do you think? What are my options? And he said, whatever you decide to do, he said, I'm going to help. I'm going to support. He said, your brother will help, will support. And so he made me feel so secure in that. He was the one that took me. I went the following week and walked in and passed the GED test. And then I went and got a couple jobs, because that's what you do when you're going to be a parent. You got to fix your life and show up for your kid.
And I do think that that is one thing I got wrong in the case I presented, is that you got your GED when you were pregnant, I think. And I think that I had read that you got your GED while you were incarcerated, but you actually had that before you were incarcerated.
Yes, I did.
Yes. I don't want to go through every specific thing of the fire again, because I want to really be able to focus on what your work is now. But there's a couple of things in the investigation that I wanted to ask you about. One of the things was, I know the police questioned you right after the fire while you were in the hospital. At that time, did you know that they suspected arson or that they were looking at you as a potential suspect?
So when they first came in, I hadn't even been admitted to the hospital. They wanted a statement right after the ambulance had deposited me in the emergency room. And my dad was the one who stepped in front and said, no, you need to wait a little bit. You need to process, because I didn't know going to the hospital that Tony was gone. Mm-hmm. As soon as I got there and saw my dad, I started crying and telling him, I'm going to stay in the hospital with Tony until he gets better. So my dad was the person that had to tell me that Tony didn't make it. And it was like he no sooner said that, and the police officer came through the curtains and said, we need to take her statement. And I was like, oh, yes, sir, I'll give you a statement. I'd never been in trouble with the law. I didn't have any clue, how you're supposed to act in that moment, what your response is supposed to be.
Right.
So my dad said, no, you need to wait. So I was admitted, and then they were back 2 hours later, and they had told me that they had determined the cause of the fire was arson. It couldn't have been anything but an arson, and they wanted to know who could have come in and done that. Well, essentially, everybody that could have come in and done that was standing in my hospital room to support me. I had a very small circle of family and friends. I'm trying to work. I'm trying to go to school. I'm trying to be a mom. So at that point, I'm afraid of literally everybody. I think, there's somebody standing in the shadows waiting to come get me.
Wow. That's a lot to take in, especially, and you were a very young mother. You were 21?
Yes.
Yeah. I was trying to think back to what my life looked like at 21, and I think that you handled yourself amazingly for a 21-year-old in the situation that you were in. Did you know when you were in the hospital that you had the right to not talk to the police?
I mean, not really. When you're in that moment, you feel like, I'm innocent. I didn't do anything wrong. And you want to help, especially when they tell you that somebody intentionally did this.
Right.
So your first instinct is, I want to help. I need to know who did this to my son. I need to know who tried to do this to me. I need to know why. That's always the big burning question. Why did this happen? Who would have done this? So it never occurred to me not to talk to them.
Yeah, I think that's true for a lot of us. Even for me, I feel like there's this pull, and I hear especially this for missing persons cases too, where the police want to search the house, and they'll find something in the house that will make them think not well of the people that are really victims of a crime, and then they'll start focusing on them instead of looking for the missing person. And I feel like, you need to protect your rights, but you also don't want to prevent the police from getting information that might help them find your person. And so I feel like a lot of people have this conflict of, do I talk to the police? Do I not talk to the police? So if you had to go back now, knowing what you know now, would you have talked to the police in the hospital, or would you have called an attorney first?
I would have called an attorney.
So you would advise everybody to always talk to the police with an attorney?
Absolutely. I tell everyone, even if it's just an accident, if police want to take a statement from you, it is your right not to say anything and to request a lawyer. Or for kids, get your parent there. Have somebody there advocating for you. Because when you're in that situation, many, many times you have just experienced or seen a traumatic event. You're in shock. Mm-hmm. You're trying to process what you have just witnessed or gone through. And so I feel like that's a very vulnerable time where investigators step in, and often, the investigation goes in a direction it just shouldn't.
Yeah, that is so true. I've read that you were released from the hospital, and I believe you went back to Tom's house after you were released from the hospital. And then the police contacted you to come into the station that night to talk to them. Did you know, were you still willingly talking to them at that point, or were you starting to be a little more concerned about their views?
No, that night I thought they figured it out. That's why they're calling me in. So I show up, I'm barefoot, I'm wearing borrowed clothes because I have literally lost everything. Everything's gone. I go in this room and they're talking to me about insurance. And my first response was to apologize and say, I'm sorry, I know my car was destroyed. I didn't have insurance on it. And they come back with, no, we're talking about home insurance or life insurance. And so my response, I think, caught them off guard because I laughed at them. Home insurance? I can't afford insurance on my car. You think I have insurance on my house? And life insurance? I'm 21. My baby is 3. You get that when you're old. You don't think when you're that young that something's going to happen, that you have to prepare for it. You're just invincible at that point. I felt like I had everything going in the right direction and things were getting ready to be great for Tony and I and my brother. Mm-hmm. So it never occurred to me until that moment. They're looking at me. They're focused on me. And why? There's no motive here.
You woke up in the trailer and it was smoky. And so they treated you for carbon monoxide exposure, which we know can affect memory. So I know for me, I was involved in a very traumatic incident, and my memories of that incident are snapshots. Like, I don't have like a full movie in my head of everything that happened from start to finish. So do you feel like your memories from that night are fragmented and you're sort of filling in blanks between, or do you feel like you have a really good understanding of everything that happened?
I feel like parts of it are snapshots. And so you can't sit there and just go in a straight line like people want. Mm-hmm. I mean, when I woke up, it took me a minute to realize I was seeing smoke. My first thought was, it's foggy in here. And so you're, trying to grasp what happens. And then in that moment, the panic sets in and you can't breathe. You've got this weight sitting on your chest and you are in full blown survival. And how do I get to my baby? What do I have to do? You aren't thinking about things like, wait until the fire department gets there before you try to get into that room, or all the things they tell you after the fact. You are caught up in that moment. So afterwards, they didn't test me for my carbon monoxide amount. They did treat me with oxygen. I was on a breathing mask for a while and was coughing up black sputum.
Yeah.
It's just, you don't know in that moment what's accurate and what's not.
That is so true.
It was used against me because I said I heard Tony wake me up and I heard him tell me it was hot. I am an intelligent woman. I know scientifically that my baby was gone before the flames even broke out. In my heart, my baby woke me up and saved my life. And so in that moment, I was so sure that he was all right, that he had gotten me out, that he was going to get out. And then, I'm running around trying to get into that room. And I have neighbors who told me, they held me back. They smacked my face and told me I couldn't go back in the front door. I had one person that testified, and he said he had a nervous breakdown afterwards because he kept hearing my screams. Mm-hmm. And for me, I don't remember screaming. I just remember this panic to get in there.
And I think a lot of people that haven't had the experience of a very traumatic moment where they were then required to go back through every little incident in the order that it happened, like the police want you to, don't realize how memory works in those moments. I was involved in a really traumatic moment, and I'm just going to give you this one example because I want our listeners to understand that in that moment, there was somebody that was severely injured, And I remember reaching into a bag that was nearby and pulling out a blanket to cover them up because I knew they were in shock. And I can see that in my head. And there's other witnesses that were there that assure me that that actually happened. But when I see it in my head, I see myself pulling out a quilt that I own that was custom made for me. It was not there that day. And so I don't think people realize that your brain will remember specific incidents, but there's going to be holes and your brain will fill in something familiar, even if it wasn't actually there in that moment. And so memories, especially during trauma, are not fully reliable. And I think that's really hard for a lot of people to understand until they've lived through it. And I know when I was explaining to the police what happened, they were asking me for specific details about that moment. Like, you put a blanket on, what color was the blanket? And I was like, I gave them completely the wrong color because that was what my brain filled in. And so I think a lot of people don't understand that agreeing to questioning so soon after an event can be detrimental. And even once we've had time to process what happened, your memories can be unreliable. And I feel like police need more training in that. That's my opinion.
I feel like they do as well.
When you were called to the police station that night, you'd been in the hospital, and they obviously treated you with oxygen. And I think I read that you had some burns on your arms from trying to get back into Tony's room. Were you medicated at all? Like, would this have been unethical for them to question you at this point?
I never thought about it. I was on, I think they gave me Xanax to calm me down. And I don't know, how much I was taking. I don't know how much they gave me. All of that kind of seems like it was this period that I just get glimpses of because you're in shock. My mom and my stepmom told me they gave me a shower while I was there in the hospital. I have absolutely no memory of that. I remember waking up and I was clean again, and you could see they had bandaged my feet because I'd ran over rocks and glass and cut my feet. I had burns, and a lot of my hair and my eyebrows and eyelashes were gone. So there's a lot that they told me, they came in and gave you medicine, and I'm like, okay, because it's like you just can't grasp what's happening in that moment. It seems like everything is just kind of out of focus.
Right. I read in one article that the police actually attended Tony's funeral. Were they there at his funeral?
Yes. They were at the funeral home when my parents took me to plan the funeral. They were at the store where I bought an outfit to wear to my baby's funeral. They showed up at the funeral, and then they showed up at the burial. And that was the point that I was just angry. I didn't want to see them. I wanted them out investigating. You've told me it's this horrible crime. I'm telling you I didn't do it. Where else are you looking? Because every time I look up, I see you.
I can't even imagine how infuriating I would be in that moment. I probably would go to prison at that point for my reaction. That just makes me so angry inside. I just want to go outside and scream right now.
That's actually the point in time where they asked me to do a polygraph.
So they asked you to do a polygraph?
They asked me to do a polygraph because I said, what's it going to take for me not to see you? For you to get out and investigate this? Why are you here? And they said, well, if you'll take a polygraph, we can eliminate you.
Oh. And then I read that in that polygraph, they asked you if you're responsible for the fire, and you responded in the negative. And then later on said that they didn't believe you and asked you why you did it, which to me feels like entrapment. It feels like they let you believe that you had exhibited some signs of dishonesty. Was that what they were doing? Was entrapping you?
So I feel like it. I feel like if you've ever watched any of the videos on false confessions, that's what they were trying to get. I mean, they hooked me up. They told me they were going to ask me a series of questions. In fact, he asked me 3. I answered no to all 3. Did I buy accelerant? Did I start the fire? Did I kill my son? And at that point, he unhooked me and told me that, the machine said that I was lying, and I just needed to tell him what I did. And I was like, I didn't do anything. And he said, no. He said, I've been doing this a long time. And he said, I know that this machine does not ever get it wrong. So you just need to tell me. And I said, I don't know. I don't know that I did anything, and I don't have anything to tell you. So he badgered me for a while with that polygraph, and something like that sticks with you, somebody telling you you didn't pass it. So during my exoneration process, that was one of the things I wanted. I wanted another polygraph. I wanted somebody to show me the way it's done correctly. Mm-hmm. I wanted to know I passed it. And then my lawyers asked for that original polygraph so they could look at the results, and they claimed that they lost it. They had no results to share with them.
Wow. So I'm guessing that if you knew then what you know now, you would probably advise people not to take a polygraph if police encourage it, or at least not without the presence of their attorney, correct?
Correct.
And to be aware that even when you're being questioned by police, whether it's with polygraph or without, that the police don't have any requirements to be honest with you. They can lie about the results of the polygraph. They can lie about evidence that they have. They can lie about a witness, what a witness says, in order to try to coerce you into saying something that they can twist into a confession. And I felt like that's what really happened to you with the polygraph. I know a couple of days before your trial, there's a headline in the newspaper, or a story in the newspaper about you, and they used what you had said after the polygraph completely out of context.
Right, that I don't know. Yes.
I don't know why I think it was I don't know why I did it, was what they quoted, and it just inflamed me. Did you feel like the news cycle, I know that the Susan Smith trial happened not long before your trial. Did you feel like the news cycle also sort of worked against you here because the public opinion was already being persuaded by this other huge trial, and it made it easier for people to think poorly of you?
I definitely think that played into it. I mean, that was a very exposed case. Yeah. I mean, every news station had it. Everybody was talking about this mother that could do the unthinkable. And so I think that really played into it. But what most people don't know, I mean, I was released on bond, and I had people screaming at me on the street, murderer, baby killer. I was afraid to go anywhere, to do anything. And then, people say, well, why were you self-medicating? Are you kidding? I'm getting nothing but all this ugliness on one side, and I'm already broken on the inside. And it's like, at that moment, I didn't care if I woke up.
Yeah, I read that quote from you in a story, and I'm not gonna lie, it made me cry because I'm getting all emotional now. I can't imagine. And I think that the fact that you persevered through all of this is honestly miraculous. And no thanks to the investigators, because I really do think that, they weren't fair, they weren't impartial. I also read that your attorney had never been involved in a murder case. Is that typical when you have a public defender, that you can get an unqualified defender for your kind of case? Do you know?
Absolutely it is. I mean, we have a limited budget for public defenders. So it's a crapshoot. People don't realize when you go into the system, the prosecution side has all the resources, everything that they need at their disposal. Where a public defender, especially in a small county, may be brand new. He might have just gotten his law degree, and he doesn't have the resources that the prosecution does. So how can he adequately do a defense? He's on the short end of the stick immediately.
And do you know if he ever requested the results of the gas chromatographs from the forensic testing?
I don't believe he did. That was never something that was mentioned at my trial. We had fire investigators. The problem was, I'm just a lay person. Even to this day, with everything I know, I'm still just a lay person. So if I'm sitting there and I can't understand what the investigators are saying, how is my jury going to understand what the investigators are saying. You are essentially, going up against somebody from the government, from the ATF, and you need to make sure that people can understand what you're saying. So I don't feel like that ever came across.
That's something that I struggle with a lot. When, you get these experts up on the stand, and I've seen this in other trials that I've been investigating, they'll say something that's actually exculpatory, but nobody in the courtroom understands it. And so even the defense attorneys, if they haven't had the budget or the wherewithal to hire an expert that can understand those things, it sometimes gets completely glazed over, and the jury never gets that understanding that should be potentially exculpatory or should at least be introducing some doubt. It wasn't really until I started a true crime podcast about criminal fires that my complete faith in the justice system eroded. I don't have any faith in it anymore because it's so biased. And if you don't have the finances to hire an attorney that is a bulldog and knows their stuff, it's so likely that there's going to be things that get missed, get overlooked. Your socioeconomic status should not determine how the justice system treats you, and it absolutely does.
Yes, it does. Most people don't know that.
It really does. How did you feel when you found out that the attorneys in Chicago from Northwestern were going to be taking on your PCR case?
Whew. I mean, that's right up there with the moment I walked out of prison. I mean, these are Innocence Network attorneys. And when they walked in, I'm trying to sell it. And so I'm telling them everything I know, that we need to get the ATF file, that we need to look at the photographs, that we need to, get every piece of evidence they've got and you tried to use against me and reevaluate it. And I'm letting them know everything that I know about fires, everything I've investigated up until that time. And I remember my attorney, Jane, she squeezed my hand and she said, "Just talk to me like a mom." And I just started crying and I said, "I wouldn't have ever done this." I said, "I didn't plan for Tony, but he was the greatest gift I was ever given in my life." I said, when you become a mom, you discover you're not just seeing things through your eyes. You're seeing it all over again through your child's eyes, and it brings this sense of wonder and beauty that you have forgotten because we're so, I guess, cynical about the world. And so when you have a kid, they make it seem like anything's possible. And so they left, and I was told, they'll make a decision. And I waited 3 months before I got that decision. So when I got it, I was like, oh, this is it. This is the moment.
Did you feel like that really leveled the playing field finally? That finally you were starting on a level playing field with the justice system?
I did, until we got the ATF file and I discovered that the report used against me had been altered. And
I know that the forensic chemist, Kennard, passed away in 2013, but during this whole PCR process, did anyone ever question him, or was he ever called to account for why the report was changed?
He was not. All we could go off of was what he had already testified to. And then my investigators, Jamie McAllister, John DeHaan, Malooly, they went back through it and said, clearly he knew from the gas chromatograph that there was no accelerant there. So to do this at the time of trial meant that someone was trying to mislead the jury to think that there was some kind of an accelerant that was there that was not.
And, I have a lot of mixed feelings about this because I know that the arson investigation method has now been debunked, that a lot of arson investigators were told and taught that when you have irregularly shaped burn patterns on the floor, that is proof positive that there is an accelerant. We now know that this has been disproven. We know that flashover, melted polyurethanes, even ventilation pathways in the fire that can cause these types of irregularly shaped burn patterns. So, part of me wants to have a little bit of compassion for the investigators who honestly believed, because they were taught improperly, that this was arson. But on the other hand, it's not their job to get up in court and give their belief. It's their job to get up in court and tell the truth and let the jury decide whether or not there's reasonable doubt. And so, it's at some level, I have like this little bit of sympathy for the investigators, but the fact that they went and falsified evidence and allegedly colluded to modify this report, just, I don't know how it doesn't make everyone want to just go burn the justice system to the ground. It just makes me furious.
It really does me too. I speak often about the forensics of fire science, and it's really easy in a classroom because there's two doors leading in on either side. And so I explain to them, they have walked the same way in and out those doors every single day for years. If half of it burns by an accident and the other half is by arson, you will see the same pattern on the floor walking in and out of those doors and over to their desks the same day, because we have compressed those fibers. We have wore down that path so it burns differently. And then any polyurethane in the room is going to melt and puddle and go to that track that's wore down a little differently. So there is no science there. It just means that's a traffic pattern.
Right.
We don't, if the gas chromatograph does not show carbon points for an accelerant, there is nothing there. And I think that's what we lose when we're talking to these experts. We have one definite science, that's DNA. The other ones have scientific methods, but I feel like too often we get investigators in there that push it beyond the limits and say it's something more than the little bit of evidence they have.
That is so true. And one of the things that I talk about a lot, I've talked about it in our social media accounts, is that there are things that can masquerade as accelerants, even in laboratory testing. A lot of times the types of mastics that they use to adhere like floor tiles or to adhere like those linoleums and floor coverings and stuff can absolutely have hydrocarbons in them. Almost everything we put in our houses these days have hydrocarbons. And so to just look at one result and say, oh, there's a hydrocarbon here, there's an accelerant, can be exceptionally misleading if you're not looking at everything that's in the room and determining if something could have melted and left a hydrocarbon there, or how was the floor affixed to the subfloor? Was there hydrocarbon there? And so I think that especially in cases where people are being defended by a public defender and have limited budgets, where they can't hire experts to look at the forensics, these people aren't getting fair trials, because everyone needs to have that look over their shoulder. Everyone needs to be able to say, here's my scientific proof that I have gotten from laboratory testing, and somebody else needs to peer review that from a different perspective and say, if I was looking at this trying to disprove it, how could I disprove it? Because that's the only way to get to the closest approximation of truth that we can get without an absolute science like DNA.
It bothers me that there are certain states that I can take the arson investigation test and pass it. I'm a lay person. There should be extra training, certifications for arson investigators, and the fact that we just don't care enough to make sure they have that training, that bothers me on every level.
And it should. And here's something that I always tell people in their communities when they're looking at people that get really involved in their communities, especially in budgeting, is I tell people, your arson investigators, your forensic investigators, your investigators, they need the budgets to go and get the training that's available. And because so many of these towns and cities and municipalities, especially in rural areas, are working on shoestring budgets, just because someone has arson investigator behind their name doesn't mean that they're an expert. I went to college for I went for 5.5 years, but that's another story. For 5.5 years to study fire and to study the physics of fire to become a fire protection engineer. And when people mistake me all the time as saying, oh, she's a fire investigator, I'm like, no, I'm not. I'm a fire protection engineer. I actually didn't learn anything about investigating fires, but I learned a lot about the physics of fire and how it works. But why aren't our fire investigators fire protection engineers? where they have spent years and years studying the physics of fire. And there's one answer and one answer only, and that is budgets. It is expensive. There's only 2 colleges in the United States that have undergraduate fire protection engineering programs. And there's a couple more that have graduate programs. But even getting access to the information that we have to teach people fire dynamics, it's so rare to find people that are truly fire experts. You know, when you talked about the experts that helped in your case, those are names I've heard of. And that shouldn't be the case. There should be so many experts out there on fire that we shouldn't be able to recognize our fire experts by name. We should be like, well, where is he? And who's he work with? And, you know, trying to find that. But there's no 6 degrees of separation. I joke that in our industry, we all know each other because we all went to the same college. We all work together.
Absolutely. When they told me that John DeHaan was coming in to testify at my post-conviction relief hearing, I was like, holy smokes, that guy wrote the manual I've been reading, this National Fire Protection Agency manual. And they were like, yeah, how do you know that? I read it. I know.
I was so impressed with how much research you did. Now, I read that when you were doing research in the law library and reading your court transcripts, that there was words you didn't understand. So you read other arson cases to try to get context to understand that terminology. And I was like, that's really smart.
Well, I mean, just reading a V pattern, I'm like, what does that mean? And so then to find out that it means something burnt there, and you know something burnt there because the smoke went up and made a V pattern. Why don't we just say the smoke went up and made a V pattern? We don't necessarily know what burnt there. We just know there was something there that created this V pattern. So a lot of the time when I was reading through it, I was like, oh, don't we have, fire science for dummies or something?
We don't.
We don't.
No, in fact, the NFPA codes are hundreds and hundreds of codes long, and I have all of them because it's my day job to interpret code. But even now, I've been interpreting fire codes for over 20 years, and I joke with people all the time that every single day in my job, I run into something we didn't anticipate, and it's not addressed in code, and there's no good way to address it, and we have to use engineering judgment. And that shouldn't be the case when we're talking about somebody's future and their freedom. We need to be saying in court when we're positive about something and when we're making logical leaps or engineering judgment, because that can introduce reasonable doubt, and that's the basis of a fair trial, is truth. And the more I dig into arson cases, the madder I get. But I think that it was really intelligent of you to take your court transcript and to really start digging into it on your own. And I read that you got a copy of NFPA 921.
I do. And I could not check it out at the prison library because it's a reference copy from the public library. So it cost me 10 cents a page to photocopy it, and I could only get so many pages each week. So yes, I still have that photocopied book with my notes in the margins and my Post-its.
Wow. That is fascinating. I read codes day in and day out for the past 20 years, and I still, sometimes I'm like, what do they mean by this? And NFPA has a chapter on definitions in every code, and so you'll go to the chapter on definitions, and there'll be words that they use in the code that sometimes aren't in those definitions, and then you're supposed to go to the regular dictionary. And sometimes whether or not something is proper or correct hinges on a word that's not well defined in the code. And so it requires interpretation. And a lot of people don't understand that, right? That there is so much room for interpretation in codes. And it can vary even from jurisdiction to jurisdiction how different areas of the code are interpreted. And so I would encourage anyone, if you ever, God forbid, are facing an arson accusation, you have to insist your lawyer hires a fire expert that is a real fire expert, somebody that really understands not just what the code says, but understands the physics of fire.
Absolutely. And I would also throw in, find someone who can break it down to lay terms. Because a lot of times you'll find an investigator and they're talking over your head. You can't really follow. And so you truly have a jury of your peers. So if you're just a high school educated person, you're more than likely to have a few people that are just high school education. If you can't follow it, they're not following it.
All right, I have a couple more areas of questioning I want to be sure to get to, and we can always come back to anything else that you want to talk about at the end, but I want to make sure I don't want to waste your time. But one of the questions I wanted to ask you was, when you went into prison, you were pregnant with your second son. What sort of medical support did you receive as a pregnant woman in prison?
You get an extra milk and a pregnancy snack.
That's it?
That's it.
Did you have prenatal care, ultrasounds, anything to make sure that the baby was okay?
So you were taken out to the hospital. They don't do any of that inside the prison, so you have to go for clinic visits. And so what most people don't know is you are handcuffed and shackled when you go out for those visits. They don't put the belly chain on you because the baby's not a prisoner. So pregnant women, they get out of that, but they don't have enough soft cuffs for everybody. So I would come back and the girls that I was incarcerated with would tape pads to the back of my ankles and the front of my feet because the shackles would dig in and actually cut me. Because you would be out all day. I mean, they would take you out first thing in the morning and you had to wait till every single pregnant woman was seen. And then you would all go back together at the end of the day. So as you're sitting there and your feet are swollen, they're already swollen because you're pregnant, they're digging into you.
And then when you went into labor and were taken to the hospital, you delivered your second son via C-section. How long was it before you went back to prison?
36 hours.
36 hours. And what extra support did you get when you were back in prison as you were trying to heal from a C-section?
Nothing at first because they released me right back to normal duties. And then they realized after a couple of days of going up and down the stairs that I had pulled my staples. So at that point, they put me on bed rest for a couple weeks.
They put you on normal duties 36 hours after major abdominal surgery?
Yes.
Hang on, I need to digest that for a second. I had my daughter via C-section. I couldn't get out of bed to go to the bathroom without help. Oh, it makes me so mad. Cleansing breath. When you went for your initial PCR hearing, you went in front of the same judge that had sentenced you, and the same judge that had criticized you for, quote, getting pregnant to garner support, unquote. What was it like standing in that same courtroom again in front of that same judge?
I also had the same prosecutor. So going in there, my handcuffs and shackles are as tight as they can possibly be. I am sitting there next to my lawyers. I have a deputy sheriff over my shoulder. Here's my prosecutor talking about we don't need these highfalutin lawyers coming from Chicago telling us how to do business here in Indiana. And as the fire investigators started sharing what they had learned looking at the evidence, the sheriff that was there with me come over and removed my handcuffs and shackles and brought me a bottle of water. And then that night, when we got ready to leave, because we had 2 days of the evidentiary hearing, they come back over and said, you're not going to go anywhere. We're not going to handcuff and shackle you. So they took me back over there and they were keeping my dinner warm for me because they'd already served dinner in the jail. And so this was, a total 360 because when I first went to court, they were giving me moldy bread. They just didn't care. They treated me like a baby killer. So to have, such profound testimony and see the effect on it on law enforcement that was there with me, I thought that was really monumental.
knowing that everyone else that was in the courtroom realized the injustice that was carried out by removing your shackles, the different way they treated you. Was it just completely a gut punch to find out that the judge later, I think wasn't it like 8 months it took him to decide on the PCR?
Yes.
And then he denied it?
Yes. He said that none of the new evidence would have made a difference to my jury. So at that point, you're, trying to decide what to do. And my lawyers, they are rock stars. They walked in there and said, we're going to fight. We're going to fight all the way to the end. We are never giving up on you. You just need to stay strong. And I'm like, I'm strong. Let's do this. And so they break it down for you. When you go to appeal that decision, they pick one case out of 100 for oral argument. And so I thought about it and I was like, let's do it. They're going to pick our case. And they picked our case.
Did the lawyers prepare you for the potential that the judge was going to deny the PCR and that you were going to have to appeal? Were you expecting to go to appeal, or were you really expecting that you would probably win based on the new evidence?
I was expecting to go to appeal.
You were?
My judge and prosecutor had nothing nice to say about me. They dismissed and treated my investigators, who are the top of the line fire investigators. They treated them like they were, from Podunk, USA, and had no intelligence to speak on fire science. And so at that point, I pretty much knew, we're not getting anywhere here. This isn't going to happen.
And then when they went and presented oral arguments in front of the Indiana Supreme Court, you were not permitted to go to that hearing, were you?
I was not. No prisoners go to the appellate court to listen. So I had church volunteers that actually showed up, and they come back into the facility and told me, she said, I met your lawyer who did an incredible job. And she said, I also met his wife and his kids because he brought them with him and said, I wanted them to know this is the reason I'm fighting. This is what we're fighting for. And she said it was so beautiful to me. And I just started crying because they literally latched onto me and treated me like family. My lawyers had my back through it all. And, they're superheroes in my book.
Yeah, I think you're a superhero in my book. I don't know how you survived all this, to be honest with you. And then to have the wherewithal to find out that your initial appeal, before the PCR, but your initial appeal, which claimed that your rights were violated in court, failed. But your lawyer didn't even come to court to tell you. You got a letter?
Yes.
That would have been my giving up point. I'm not going to lie. That would have been my, I'm done. But then you, in the article I read, it said you cried that day, and you got up the next day and was like, I don't have the luxury. I don't have the luxury of giving up here. I got to figure out what I'm doing next. And I just was like, wow, that is strength right there. And then to find out about the forensic evidence and be like, this is it. This is my golden ticket. This is proof that I was treated unfairly and that the jury didn't have the information that they needed, and still have a judge say, not good enough. That would have been my second giving up point. That would have been my, I'm never getting out of bed again. And then to know that they went in front of the appellate court and that they argued the case without you there and have to wait. Was it another 8 months, I think?
It was. And of course, my attorneys are trying to prepare me because usually the appellate court comes back very quickly. So they're trying to prepare me for a denial. And I said, let's just wait. Let's just wait till we get it. So I don't even remember where I was that morning. I was called back to the unit to speak to my attorney in the counselor's office. And so when I picked up the phone, she said, we won. We did it. And she said, you are going to get another day in court and people are going to get to hear your truths. And so I walked out of there. I'm walking on air at that point. And I don't think it's really sunk in, except she had to go through a lot of staff members in order to get a phone call over to my counselor. And so every single one wanted to know, why are you calling? Because, of course, I've been on the news. I've been in the paper. People know. And so that day I had lunch with the head of classification and the major over the custodial staff. And they're congratulating me and talking about, what are you going to do when you get out? And I was like, I'm going to walk in the grass barefoot. I want to feel the grass. I want to know that I'm able to go do that.
And one of the first things that you did when you got out was go visit Tony's grave. Is that correct?
Yes.
And I read that even there that you were being photographed and videoed. And I just feel like, I know it's not my fault. I want to apologize to you, because that should not have been a moment that was sullied by that kind of intrusion. What do you want? What do you want people to remember about Tony?
I want them to remember that he was beautiful.
He really was. I saw pictures of him. He was beautiful.
He saw the world in this incredibly perfect way, a way that I still can't fully grasp, because I have been warped a little bit by our justice system. That he loved to go fishing, that he chased butterflies, he called them flutterbys, and, he probably didn't have the perfect upbringing, because he liked to watch Arnold and would tell everybody, I'll be back, and he played Nintendo with my brother and his friends, and he was better at it than me at 3 years old. And when life gets me down and I think I just can't take it another day, I remember that he would have found something beautiful. And I keep going.
After your release, you actually started a nonprofit. You co-founded a nonprofit, is that correct?
That's correct.
And the goal of the nonprofit, I read, was to connect people like you with resources in the community. Can you talk to me a little bit about what kinds of resources that you needed help with after you were released?
Absolutely. I mean, people don't realize most wrongful convictions, it takes a long time to overturn them. So I had never had a cell phone. I had never been on the internet. I used cash, not credit cards or an app to pay for something. I had no clue about using email. I didn't understand, why they took the knobs away from water when I was in. Now it's a sensor, and it's not like you have a handbook that tells you, hey, when you go in there, you need to run your hands underneath there and the water's going to kick on. So all of those things really made me feel like I'm not going to be able to step back into life. And having people just understand that I'm not comfortable going out in public, because I don't know, am I going to have to interact with something that I don't understand? Am I going to have to order from a kiosk? What am I going to look like while I'm out doing that? So you're so isolated in those moments. I went to work right after I got out for Northwestern University. Mm-hmm. Those students introduced me to things. They gave me courage. They took me in and taught me how to order at Starbucks, because you don't understand about a shot of this and a flavor of this. And
I'm still scared to order at Starbucks.
Absolutely. And so they just made me feel like, it's okay. You don't have to know everything. And so that's really what opened my eyes to, people can get involved and can help in ways that don't cost anything except some of your time. Some of them have never seen a computer. Show them how to turn it on. Show them how to set up an email. Show them what they can do. Because I guarantee they're going to soar once you give them the tools. This past year, I closed down J for J, which is what we called it for short, just because when we initially opened it, it was just for people that have been fully exonerated. with COVID, we had a number of people that were Innocence Project clients that were given clemencies, that were pushed out. So technically, they haven't been fully exonerated, but they deserve the same help that I do. And so through the non-for-profit, my hands were really tied and I couldn't do anything. And I was like, you know what? We're going to stop this and I'm going to start working with other non-for-profits and we're going to help the whole community because we are a community and we need to be there to support people.
So what organizations exist now? If people are hearing the story and they're, not aware or hadn't thought about these issues as people come out of incarceration, what can they do in their communities to help resolve these problems, to help these people reintegrate into society?
There are some incredible exoneree-led organizations, Life After Justice, Exonerated Nation, Organization of Exonerees. You can go right on, Google those names. Everything is going to pop up. Be a volunteer in your area. Every area has an Innocence Project. Connect with them and tell them you would like to volunteer and offer support for exonerees. It's just that easy.
And I would go a step further and say, not just exonerees need this support. We have people that were incarcerated, and even if they were not wrongfully convicted, once they serve their sentence, the reintegration process into society is exceptionally difficult. And from examples that I have seen in my community, we've seen people that they come out of being incarcerated with no support system. They don't have family. They're indigent, essentially. They come out with whatever money they had left in commissary on a little debit card, and then they have to pay for their own drug testing. They have to be able to get to their probation meetings without transportation. They have a time limit for getting a job, and they have to be able to prove that they're looking for a job, but they don't have transportation to get there, and they don't have a phone to answer when the employer calls them. So I have seen in my community that we give these people no support. There's no organization to help these people as they try to transition back in society. And once they've paid their debt, they need that opportunity to transition back to society, because what, in my mind, drives people to criminal activity is when they don't have good choices available to them. They only have bad choices to get by. And if we're not giving them a choice to be able to afford the transportation to get to the required meetings or to be able to afford the required drug testing, then we're basically saying, well, if you can't afford this, then you're breaking the conditions of your parole and you're going to have to go back. So what choices are we giving them? And it infuriates me. So I would encourage people, I'm going to link all the organizations you mentioned in our show notes for people that want to get involved with helping exonerees. But I would also encourage people to look for opportunities to help just formerly incarcerated people, whether they're exonerees or not. Like you said, there's a lot of people in prison that serve their full sentence and are not guilty because the Innocence Project never had the opportunity to pick up their case, or they didn't have fair representation, or they had an inexperienced attorney. And we need to be giving these people the opportunity to reintegrate into society effectively without having to make bad decisions to do it.
Absolutely. I would also throw in there, if you offer somebody a job, that will be the best employee you have ever gotten, because they are so happy that somebody had faith in them. Somebody saw that they could come back and be productive, and they won't do anything to mess that up. And they will be loyal to that job and do their best every single day.
And then the other question I wanted to ask you is, as a mother that gave birth while incarcerated, what do you want to see happen to help support mothers in prison? Because these children, even if we're talking about a guilty mother, these children didn't do anything to deserve to have their relationship with their parents severed in a way that our justice system does. So where do we need to go from here? How do we help maintain these family relationships through incarceration?
Absolutely. I think what most people don't realize is when you get a job in a prison, like mine paid $1 per day for an 8-hour job. So a lot of times we're talking about privatized facilities. So I may make $1 sewing, prison uniforms that they're going to turn around and sell to another prison for $20 a uniform. So when you take in everything that they don't provide, because a lot of times women have to buy their own sanitary napkins and tampons because they don't provide it, or they don't provide enough. They have to buy all of their hygienes. There isn't a lot left over for stamps so they can write their kids. You're given 2 stamps per month that's supposed to go for legal mail. That's it. So, donating cards and stamps, or even, art supplies so the moms can make cards and letters for their kids and send it off. That's a great way to get involved. But think, farther out. It doesn't take anything to get a company to donate cassette players. Go in, let the mom pick out a book, record reading that story to her child, and then give that child the headset, the book, and the cassette so they can hear their mom reading them stories. Find ways that you can get those stuffed animals with those little voice boxes where the parent can record a message to their child, and every time they push it, they hear their mom or dad telling them, "I love you."
I think a lot of people just never think about what they could be doing in their communities. And they never think about what the impacts on families are. Because even if somebody in your family is incarcerated, whether wrongfully or not, everyone in that family pays a price. Everyone. And the kids are the biggest victims. And not being able to have that tight relationship with an incarcerated person because their visiting time with them is limited. Their ability just to get a hug or just to talk to mom after they've had a bad day. Those kids didn't do anything wrong. And we need to find a way to do better as a society.
Absolutely. So many facilities have kiosks now and iPads so that you can do video visits. I don't think most people realize they're charging for those video visits.
And they're expensive.
They are very expensive. And so to give somebody a year worth of video visits so they could see their kids, that would change those kids' life. Because they're not the ones incarcerated. Their parent is. I don't forget where I've been. So I've worked on legislation to help, because in Indiana, if you were sentenced to over 24 months, your parental rights were automatically terminated. So that was one of the first things we stepped in to do. We also worked with a local church to do a reentry support group, because what they give them as reentry packets are not places that you can find a place to live, get help with transportation or a job. Everything was outdated. They say we're spending all this money on reentry. I can't tell, because those people were coming out and they had nowhere to go. So a bunch of us that were incarcerated together got together and said, we're going to tell them, this is where you go, this is where you get help, this is who you can call for support. And it's life-changing, because after being in there, I know that there are a number of people that are there for substance abuse issues, mental health issues, or just because they made a mistake, they were trying to take care of their family. Mm-hmm. It changes your eyes when you're in that situation.
And you brought up mental health. What sort of mental health services were available to you in prison?
They medicate you, and they have state therapists that come in and talk to you. You might get a good one, and they might do something, talk therapy, tell you, books to read, ways that you can really, kind of center yourself and get out of your head. But for the most part, you get medicated, and they want you just kind of shuffling along.
I feel like in a lot of the cases that I've looked at, that there are a lot of cases of people in prisons because they grew up in situations that were abusive or neglectful, and they didn't get the opportunity to develop those coping mechanisms and strong mental health skills. And so did you see that there was classes available or opportunities in prison where they were helping people develop those coping skills and develop those mechanisms? Or is that something that is a need still to be filled.
The first part of my prison sentence was very much like that. We had a woman superintendent, and so Dana Blank, she wanted us to have every tool we possibly could because she knew we were going to go out and we were going to have to be productive members of our community, of society. And so we had education. My associate's and bachelor's degree is from Ball State University. We had vocational program in there. I'm a licensed cosmetologist. I trained service dogs for disabled kids. Anything she could do to really educate us or help us. We had yoga in there. We had journaling with counselors that wanted to come in and volunteer. We had parenting classes from outside volunteers. She had community programs with us. And so we would meet members of the community and talk about how much support is needed for parents and children and what they can do to get involved. I mean, she was very much, this is supposed to be rehabilitation. It was probably year 7 that administration pushed her out. Everybody is put into, identical uniforms, and they started systematically picking off the educational opportunities that were in there. So now there is no college programs. The parenting program is whatever the state puts on. All of those extra classes and volunteers have been pushed out. So now it's just a normal prison. Somehow I feel like we've lost the basis of prisons because it was always supposed to be about rehabilitation.
It was. And one of the things that I actually got it from a book, a fiction book, but it really resonated with me. And the author was formerly incarcerated. He actually escaped prison, but that's another story. Oops. Anyway, he noted that, when we punish children, they respond because we have a relationship with them and they love us and we love them, right? And they're safe with us, even though they know that we're punishing them for something that they've done wrong or we're correcting them, that we still love them and we're there to protect them and look out for them. When we put people in prison, there's no love there. There's no respect. There's no mutual relationship. And so it turns from correction into torture, almost. Because punishment without love is not useful. People don't respond to it. Our psyches aren't trained to care about whether or not we let down somebody that doesn't have any respect or care for us and that we don't have any respect or care for. And so, the book really challenged people to think about incarceration differently and to think about it as, correction needs to be done by people that love each other. And we're in communities where we've just become more and more and more isolated from people, where we don't have a community system, where we don't have people that have networks that they are locked into that help guide people when they're going astray, people that love them to help bring them back to the right path. And that's something that's really missing right now. And I just think our prison system has like you said, lost sight of the fact that we're supposed to be rehabilitating people. And if we're not building relationships and building strong foundations for people to reintegrate into society, then we're just making them into slaves, where they're just doing work and not getting paid fairly for it and not being prepared to reenter society. And it's really tragic.
I always come back to this saying that I heard while I was in prison, and it was, you breed what you feed. So we have warehouses full of people that we are not giving education to. We are not training. We are not even treating them as well as I treat my dogs. And I think I tell everyone, yes, my dogs are spoiled. However, I treat them the way that I want to be treated, the way I think everybody should be treated. And so if we're doing less than, it's no wonder people get out and they go right back in. We give them no opportunity to better themselves. We don't give them what they need when they come home. And so it's just this revolving door for some people. And it doesn't have to be that way.
You're so right. I have taken up more than an hour of your time. And I want to thank you so much for talking to me, because I have so enjoyed this conversation with you. And I really do think that so many of our listeners reached out to me after listening to your story, and they were like, you know what, I hear about these wrongful conviction cases, but I don't know what I can do to help. And so you gave us the names of some organizations that help with reintegration. And then also, like you said, every area has an Innocence Project, and they need volunteers and they need funding. Is there anything else that you want our listeners to know before we wrap up?
Absolutely. I would tell them that there are very simple things you can do to get involved and make a difference within our justice system. I tell everybody, vote. That is not just for when we have a big presidential election. That is for your local people. Mm-hmm. Because if they're, out there talking about criminal justice reform, ask them what that truly means to them. See if they have, the facts to back it up what they're going to do. And always think outside the box. I am very proud. I work with the Illinois Innocence Project, and so I coordinate a speakers bureau for the wrongful conviction awareness and avoidance training. And so with that training, it's state mandated in Illinois. We go into every police academy and present on wrongful convictions, how they can be aware of the contributing factors and how they can avoid it. With each one of those trainings, they hear from an attorney, a retired police officer, and 2 exonerees on how things went wrong in the system. And so I feel like there are ways that we can start having conversations on how we can turn the system around. You just have to be looking for opportunities that we can step in and have those moments. So I would encourage everybody to get involved and see what you can do.
So you mentioned that this is required training in Illinois?
Yes.
Is this commonly required training across all the states?
No, Illinois is the only one that has ever done it. And so when it first started, probably about 6 or 7 years ago, I was one of the first asked to go in and do this training. And it was in one police training institute. And so I went in, and it was traumatic. But at the same time, I didn't want them to beat me. I didn't want them to have power over me. So I went in and I shared the story, and they asked me if I would come back, and I was like, yes, I'll come back again. So that director of that police training institute was told that he could not have a wrongful conviction class in there. That just didn't look good to the Training and Standards Board. So he continued to have the class and changed it to guest speaker. And we still come in and talked about wrongful convictions and how they can go the wrong way. And as I shared my story, I realized, you know what? I'm not just changing them. They're changing me. I'm receiving some healing from this. I'm recognizing that there are good people out there that are trying to do a really great job in, a field that they get a lot of criticism. Mm-hmm. And so I kept doing it. And then in 2023, it was mandated by the Training and Standards Board that it would be taught in every academy. And so we put together the Speakers Bureau, and I have exonerees from all over the country that fly in there in Illinois to train the police cadets.
I think that is amazing, and I think we should all be pushing to have the same type of training in every single police force across the country. Because obviously it's important, because if it wasn't, your case would have never happened the way it did.
Absolutely. And I think that was one of the reasons that I went into this and said, yes, I'll go do it initially. Because one of my police officers came up to me afterwards and said, I wish I would have asked more questions. He said, I knew that you weren't right. He said, I had witness statements that said you were acting erratically and not really yourself. He said, so I wish that I would have asked more questions and pushed for you to be tested for carbon monoxide, for us to really look at that. And he said it didn't occur to me. And I said, I appreciate that. That's how we have these open conversations. That's the way we look for ways we can change it in the future and make it different for the next person.
Okay, I do have 2 more questions that came from my 8-year-old daughter.
Okay.
She wants to know first, what was your favorite job while you were incarcerated?
Favorite job was definitely training service dogs. So we worked for ICANN, and I got my first puppy, and so I took my puppy all the way through the training. And Martha was a joy to have, but she loved squirrels. So she was never going to be a full service, service dog. That just wasn't going to happen because we couldn't tie her to a wheelchair and let a squirrel go by. So she ended up going to an elementary school, and she worked with young kids. They could read to Martha, and Martha's not going to tell them, you got that word wrong, or you stuttered when you said that. And so she brought a lot of joy there. After we did the first puppy, then we started working on more intensive training. So we were actually the graduation program. So we would get a dog, evaluate them, make sure they knew all their commands, and then we would start meeting with the families that were going to pair them. And so we would get to, name some items that the dog could go retrieve for the child, or teach them how to get up in a hospital bed with them, or how to retrieve items to a wheelchair, open doors, brace. And then we would have a 2-week training program. So those families would come in with their kids, and we would get to teach them how to use their dog. And it was so incredible to see these kids take these animals and gain independence and feel confident. I've got my dog with me. Everything's going to be okay. And so it changed my life in ways I never expected. And I stay in touch with a few of the moms whose dogs I trained for their kids. My favorite one is Michael, and Michael is nonverbal. And so I think when you hear that, you think, oh, there's going to be no communication. Never ever think that. He communicates in so many ways, and I would have him laughing so hard because I'm out there trying to talk to him, get some kind of reaction, nothing. Out comes the dog, and he goes, ah, and smiles great big, and I was like, oh, you faker. You are holding back on me. You need to be communicating with me. And he started laughing. He was shaking so hard, and his mom said, thank you for just talking to him like he's normal. And I said, he is normal. He is. Yeah. And so I think that was the moment that I realized I was able to do something and give back at the same time.
Wow. I had no idea that you got to train dogs in prison, and that is amazing. So I know you have dogs now, and the other thing my daughter would like to know is, what are your dogs' names?
So I have 2 Siberian Huskies. My little girl is all white with blue eyes, and her name is Piper. And my boy is red and white with blue eyes, and his name is Paxton. And I will email you a picture because both of them are passed out.
I wish mine was passed out. I don't have a husky. We have a red tick coonhound. And so when you say that he really likes squirrels, that's my life right now. If we have a homestead, so we have a lot of land, so it's not fenced in. So he's on a geo-collar that is supposed to correct him when he gets to the edge of the boundary. But there have been times when deer or squirrels are too appealing to heed the warnings of the collar, and then I get to go running up the side of a mountain to try to encourage him to come home.
That's awesome.
So, yeah, he could probably use some training. I am not the best dog trainer, I will tell you that right now.
Well, I can tell you that everything I learned for training dogs has not applied to my babies. When I come in, I want them to jump up and greet me and talk to me and give me kisses and everything that a service dog can't do. Mm-hmm. But, yeah, they're pets. It's their house, too. So some of that training's went by the wayside, but I've had opportunities to use it because you can volunteer with a local shelter. And, if you have a week-long break, get a dog. If you can get it walking on a leash or get it potty broke or, some of the basic principles, it's easier for that animal to be adopted.
That is true. That is true.
Absolutely.
Well, I don't want to take up your whole day. I could talk to you all day because obviously as a fire protection engineer, your case is fascinating to me from a scientific standpoint. It's fascinating to me from a legal standpoint. And it's fascinating to me from just a human standpoint. As a mom, as a woman, as somebody who once thought that I could always trust the police, and to have that insight to know that I was listening to a lawyer talk the other day, and she said, it doesn't matter if you didn't do anything wrong. It doesn't matter. You have to have a lawyer with you when you talk to the police, because the police job is not to prove you're innocent. That's your lawyer's job. And a lot of times the goal of the police is directly in violation of that goal that your lawyer has. And it's really sad to me that we live in a society where that is the case. But if there's anything that I personally want people to take away from this, it is to be cautious. You can't always trust everybody, and it's sad that we have to say that, but any final closing thoughts from you on that?
Just that I completely agree with you. Don't go in there and think that you can navigate it by yourself. Get somebody in there to protect you, protect your rights. Obviously, I thank you for the opportunity to talk with you. I was blown away when I was listening, and it said, Kristine Bunch, if you are listening, I have tried to reach out to you. And I was like, has she? So it meant so much to me just that somebody would reach out and say, hey, I want to hear from your perspective. And so I love that. And I'm incredibly honored. I would also, if you take requests, really like you to do a podcast on Todd Willingham.
We did.
Did you?
So when I
first
started the podcast, my co-host was my friend Jenny, and we did 10 episodes before we took a hiatus for almost 2 years. And then during that time, Jenny told me that she wasn't going to be able to continue. She's a single mom. These podcasts are a lot more work than I even anticipated starting.
Yes.
And so I spent that time that we were gone really thinking about what I wanted the podcast to be. And I didn't want it to be the kind of thing where you could get the information that we're giving you from a Google search. I wanted to bring something to the table that you're not going to get easily somewhere else. And so I knew that I could really dive into the science. But when I was doing it with Jenny, I think it's our second and third episode are on Cameron Todd Willingham. And I would like to revisit that case now that there's a steep learning curve to podcasting. There's also a learning curve to researching. And there's also a learning curve to being able to put together a narrative in a way that is compelling. So I do expect that in the future I'll revisit that case again and look at it more from the scientific aspects of it. But that case, I still lay in bed at night and think about that case. It was a tough one, and it was one that Jenny researched. And Jenny is not a fire expert. She is just an armchair detective that really likes true crime podcasts. I think she did a really good job with the research on it. I had not heard of the case before she presented it, so I wasn't really prepared to dig into a lot of the scientific things that came up in the case. So that's sort of why I would like to revisit it in the future. But it is such a horrifically tragic case, and it anyone that hasn't listened to it yet, I encourage you to listen to it. I think Jenny did a really good job researching it, and in the future I will revisit it more from the scientific aspects of it.
I tell people, they always ask, why do you go speak? Why do you continue to do this? Why do you continue to relive it? And I always tell them, Cameron Todd Willingham, he can't speak. I can. And we're going to make sure we don't ever do that again, because that could have just as easily have been me.
It could have.
So it touches me, but I've got a lot of ideas, and I'm going to send some names your way. William Kennard is not just in my case. There are other wrongful conviction cases that he's been named in.
I will definitely be looking forward to that information, because Yeah, I mean, especially if there's still people whose cases are ongoing that have not had their fair day in court or been treated fairly by the system. I definitely want the opportunity to help bring awareness to those cases and possibly help them push for post-conviction relief or new trials or whatever is justified.
Awesome.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. This is fun.
All right, well, thank you so much. I'm going to let you get back to your weekend and your puppies, and from the bottom of my heart, thank you.
Oh, thank you. I've enjoyed it.
I have too.